But are y'all ready for summer? Yeah, no. Well, that was a mixed reception. Some of y'all are ready. I know Jim's ready, but some of y'all don't like the heat. But you know what? It doesn't matter because summer's coming. It's about to get hot, and well, just try to enjoy it. We did yesterday. Melanie and I. Melanie don't really like to go to like a public pool area. She's really conservative when it comes to like being in a bathing suit and stuff like that. So anyway, but Blaze asked us yesterday as we were walking. He asked me yesterday as we were walking into Texas Roadhouse. He goes, "I want to go to the pool." I go, "Well, I'm down, but you ain't got to convince me. You got to convince Mama." So he turned over to Mama and talked to her, and of course, Mama can't say no to him. So we ended up going to the pool yesterday and spending some time at the pool, and it was really nice. Just did some family time together. Anyway, enough killing time. Y'all are back in your seats now. So we are in the 40th week of this series in the book of Acts. And so last week was Mother's Day. And then we took a break last week. We're jumping back into the book of Acts today. We have two chapters left, Acts chapter 27 and 28. I told you that we would probably finish this up in May. I lied. All right. Didn't lie willingly, but there's no way we're getting through this in May because today's chapter is kind of long. And so we're breaking it up into two sections. And then next week, Melanie and I are going on vacation, and Mark and Martha will be filling in. And then the week after that, we will be back in service. But I'm going to, Mr. Jim Pantano is for the first time going to be taking over, giving the message the week after that. And so we will be back in service. We'll be out next week, but we'll be back in service the following week. And we're looking forward to watching y'all's message on YouTube and then hearing Jim speak for the first time here at 1012. It's going to be good. It's going to be good stuff. But just so you know, this is going to be awesome. It's going to be a really great chapter today. It's really filled with tons of stuff that goes on. And we're going to finish halfway through it, and then you're going to have to wait 3 weeks to finish it up. So, but at this point, little review. I'm not going to spend a lot of time reviewing. I'm going to review just a little bit. At this point, Paul has stood trial 4 times. Okay, he's been on trial 4 times for a false accusation of bringing a Gentile into the temple, and he's been drug around. He stood trial once in Jerusalem in front of Claudius Lysias, which is a centurion that was over the Antonius fortress there. And he stood trial once in Jerusalem. He stood trial 3 times in Caesarea, once under Antonius Felix, and another time under Porcius Festus. And then when he stood trial under Porcius Festus the second time, he appealed to Caesar because Festus wanted to take him back to Jerusalem to stand trial in front of all the Jews there in Jerusalem. Paul knew that wasn't going to go well, so he appealed to Caesar. And before Porcius Festus could send him on to Rome, he had to find a legitimate reason to write down to send him to Caesar, to send him to the emperor. So he got visited by a guy named Herod Agrippa the second, which was a king. And during Herod Agrippa's stay in Caesarea on visiting Festus, he wanted to hear Paul. And so Festus said, "You can hear him." And so it was more like a show trial that Paul stood and gave a defense in front of Herod Agrippa. But then after giving that defense, Paul was kind of interrupted by Felix and called insane. And Paul's like, "I am not insane, man. What I'm saying is reasonable. And these things happen, not in a corner, but in front of everybody." And so we'll go back to the very last part of the 26th chapter where Agrippa says this. After they left the room, they begin saying to one another. In other words, Agrippa and Felix begin talking, and they begin saying to one another, "This man hasn't done anything wrong that deserves death or imprisonment." And in verse 32 of 26, Agrippa said to Festus, "This man could have been set free if he had not appealed to Caesar." And so that was the very last part where we left off. And so now Paul is about to be shipped to Rome. So Paul's official appeal to Caesar has now become official. And now it's just a matter of shipping Paul to Rome. And this became a journey that would impact the lives of not only Paul and his companions, but the entire ship of people that were with Paul, and which is hundreds of men. We'll see towards the end of this. So Acts 27, verses 1 through 3 is where we'll start. But here we go. So when it was decided that we would sail for Italy, Paul and some other prisoners were handed over to a centurion named Julius, who belonged to the imperial regiment. We boarded a ship from Adramyttium about to sail for ports along the coast of the province of Asia, and we put out to sea. Aristarchus, a Macedonian from Thessalonica, was with us. The next day we landed at Sidon, and Julius, this centurion, Julius, in kindness to Paul, allowed him to go to his friends so they might provide for his needs. So we have a pretty clear picture here. Paul now begins to set off on his journey to Rome. He boards a ship with several hundred other prisoners, okay, and a crew, pretty much a skeleton crew with a Roman guard, or a Roman centurion, and a crew, a captain and his crew. And Paul boards this ship. So Paul is traveling now with Aristarchus from a Macedonian from Thessalonica, and he's also traveling with Luke. So you have three people here that we're following today. We have Paul, Luke, and Aristarchus, who are on this ship that's heading to Italy to go to Rome, so that he can stand on trial in front of Caesar. And we will see towards the end of this chapter that this was a boat basically transporting prisoners to Rome. And in fact, there was 276 people aboard this vessel. Okay, so just imagine that. I mean, what do you think? Ballpark the people that we have here right now. Ballpark it. 40, 50? All right, so you take that and you quadruple it, and you still are at 200. So you add on to that, and then so you just imagine, you think you board this ship or whatever, and it's just the good thing about the scriptures, it gives you these things so that you can visualize this. And I want you to visualize this, because this chapter is a huge chapter to visualize, and I love it because I'm a fisherman at heart. And so I've been out on the sea in a 22-foot boat, 22-foot Mako, and I know how it feels to be out there. One day, I'll never forget this, we were out there fishing for snapper in the open water, and I saw a guy anchored off about 100 yards out from me, and I took out my binoculars to look and see where he was anchored out at, because he was probably on a reef, and I was trying to get there to him over there where he was. And sometime in the middle of the day, these rollers came through, man, and it wasn't bad. It wasn't like, say, on the sea you have different kinds of waves. You have like washing machine waves that are just like random waves going different ways, and they just kind of bounce you around every which way. And then you have these things called rollers, and the rollers can be really bad for the stomach, but they're really cool if you got a good strong stomach, because you'll just go up and then you'll come back down. And I'll never forget, man, pulling out my goggles and looking at that ship. And when I saw that ship, I would see him, and then I would see water, and then I would see the ship or the boat, and then I would see the water. And that's how big these rollers were. They were over our head. It was probably one of the scariest times that I've been offshore in my boat, because, imagine just looking around and seeing walls of water, and then you just come up above them, and then you just sink down below them and everything else. And those things, they don't crest. They're just these big waves and everything else. So I don't even know why I told that story, but 276 people on this boat. This isn't a 22-foot Mako. This is a huge ship, all right? And it was crew, and most of them were prisoners. So once landing in Sidon, Julius shows Paul this incredible kindness where he allows Paul, even though Paul is on a ship as a prisoner, Paul has not been charged with a crime yet. And you got to remember, Paul's a Roman citizen. And so Julius allows Paul and he shows Paul some kindness to be able to leave his oversight. And this is a huge thing, and you'll see it towards the latter part of this chapter, because again, if a centurion ever lost track of a prisoner, what would happen is that whatever that prisoner was charged for would then be put on them. They would serve the consequences of that. But again, Paul has not yet been charged, so he allows him to go, to leave his supervision, to go out and show kindness to friends, knowing that and believing that Paul is going to come back on his own accord. And so Julius allows him to go off and to do this. And so we continue on. Verse 4, from there we put out to sea again and passed to the lee of Cyprus, because the winds were against us. To the lee of Cyprus. Now, as I'm reading this, as I'm listening to this in my van during my work week, you'll see this word lee often, and I was like, I don't ever remember hearing it called lee Cyprus, But let me finish this and I'll elaborate. So, when we sailed across the open sea off the coast of Cilicia and Pamphylia, we arrived in Myra in Lycia. Now remember, we've heard of Lycia before. This is, if you've been in this book for as long as we have, Paul's visited these places. But so they landed, though, in this place, Myra in Lycia. There, the centurion found an Alexandrian ship sailing for Italy, and put us on board. So they do a unique thing where they get off of the ship that they were on, they port in Lycia, in Myra, Lycia, and then the captain and the centurion find another boat, which is called an Alexandrian boat, and they change crew, and they take all the prisoners from that one boat that they sailed, and they put them on this other Alexandrian boat. But first, for your reading pleasure, let me just tell you that lee actually means sheltered by something, okay? And so if you see in this reading throughout this entire chapter, you'll see that they sail to the lee of Cyprus, and they sail to the lee of Crete. And so anytime that they say lee, it's not necessarily the first name of that island or that location. It actually means a shelter of something. And so I found that interesting because, as a person that's been on a boat before, I've never used that vocabulary. I've never used the lee as a vocabulary, but that's what it means. So either way, so at Myra and Lycia, they switched ships. Now, we know what these ships look like. This was an Alexandrian ship. I think we actually have first, so this is kind of what this ship looks like. It's a huge ship. It's like over 200 feet long. It's about 40, 50 feet wide. I mean, it's a pretty big ship. But one of the interesting things about these types of ships is they were food cargo ships. They would use them like grain ships, and they would haul barley and grain and stuff all the way to Italy. And as I was listening to another guy talk this last week, he said that there was a historian that talked about how in those days the ports at Rome, the ports in Italy, were just constantly full of ships coming in and offloading and stuff like that. So you had these type. But the interesting thing about the ship is it didn't have a rudder. All right, it had two oars, one on either side of the back of it, and so this is how they directed the ship. And you got to remember, guys, this is all before Google. All right, and like long time before Google and GPS, a long time before sonar and all the tools and instruments, a long time before VHF radios that we now use to be able to contact ship to ship or ship to shore. So these guys sailed by looking at the stars, man. It was their direction. And another thing that was typical, if you could throw up that map, Josh, another thing that was typical is what they would do is they would sail close to land as well. And so as they begin to sail, you'll see the typical way of them making their route is when they leave Caesarea and they land at Sidon, which is where we just left from, and then we sailed over to Lasea. That you see how they hugged the shoreline? That's what they did. They would hug the shoreline and stay close to the shoreline because they would be protected from sailing out in the open sea. And so they land at Lasea. They switch ships. They get on a grain ship heading to Italy. And again, the way that these ships traveled was way different than what we travel today. And it's important that you know that for what's about to happen. Okay? And so 27 verse 7. So we made slow headway for many days and had difficulty arriving off Cnidus. When the wind did not allow us to hold our course, we sailed to the lee of Crete. We sailed by the shelter of the island of Crete, opposite Salmone. We moved along the coast, again, typical way of sailing. We moved along the coast with difficulty and came to a place called Fair Haven, near the town of Lasea. Verse 9, much time had been lost. Okay, again, all this is fun reading. Like, this is a fun chapter, right? But you got to catch on to what's going on here. They sailed close to the shore, but they still ran into difficulties. So it took them a lot longer to get where they are now. And seasons mean everything if you're on water. All right? Seasons mean everything if you're on water. And so they lost time, and they eventually ended up in Fair Haven. So in verse 9, much time had been lost, and sailing had already become dangerous because by now it was after the Day of Atonement. Now, the Day of Atonement in this year of 2023 was September 25th. Now, it's on the Jewish calendar at a certain time, but it kind of changes on our calendar, just like Easter does, and so on. But and even us, like, what's happening around September? Yeah, hurricane season, right? And so we know, like, I'll never forget when we went to launch this church. We had a date of October the 12th, 10/12, right? We had the date of October the 12th, and we had set out to launch on that date, but guess what happened right before that? Hurricane Ike hit. All right, and so Hurricane Ike delayed some things, and it really messed up our advertisement that we had set out to do, and we were without electricity for like a week or two right after Hurricane Ike. And so you can tell that Paul is saying, like, this is after the Day of Atonement. Like, this is not good. This is not going to turn out so well. So Paul warned them, verse 10, men, I can see that our voyage is going to be disastrous and bring great loss to ship and cargo and to our own lives also. But the centurion insisted on listening to what Paul said. But the centurion insisted, instead of listening to what Paul said, followed the advice of the pilot and the owner of the ship. I mean, these are the people that have the most to lose, right? Verse 12. Since the harbor was unsuitable to winter in, the majority, they took a vote, and you can just see how this goes, right? The majority, they're like taking a vote, and they're like, all right, raise your hand if you want to leave Fairhaven, and go over to Phoenix. And they, most people raise their hand, and Paul's like the only one that wants to stay there. And he kind of elbows Aristarchus and Luke and says, you guys raise your hand too, and so, but the majority of the people wanted to leave Fairhaven and travel to Phoenix. Not Phoenix, Arizona, but Phoenix off the island of Crete. So since the harbor was unsuitable to winter in, and the majority decided that we would sail on, hoping to reach Phoenix and winter there, because this was the harbor in Crete facing both southwest and northwest. And so you could tell that the decision was being made, because if you left the ship in a harbor during the wintertime and it wasn't fair, it wasn't a good harbor, it could be destroyed. So that had a lot to play in it. But nobody wanted to winter, to spend the rest of the winter in Fairhaven. Now we can throw that map back up, please. Look at the distance here. You're not talking about a long journey here. So you're looking at them and Fairhaven. If you find the island of Crete right in the center of the page, and you go to Fairhaven, look at how far it is from Fairhaven to Phoenix. It's about a 40-mile journey, all right? And on seas, that's not that long. That's like what Gilligan's Island 3-hour tour type stuff, I mean, it's not that long of a sail to go from Fairhaven to Phoenix. And because Paul warned them and said, look, it's going to be a disaster, the majority just said, let's go ahead to Phoenix. Phoenix probably was a better place anyway for the ship and crew. There probably was more to do there. But Paul warned them and said, don't do it, guys. This is going to be a disaster. And of course, they're saying, well, we're not listening to this preacher man. The captain and the crew want to sail to Phoenix. We're going to Phoenix. All right. But anyway, what experience do you have, preacher man? And I think this is interesting, because do you know that by this time, Paul has logged in over 3,000 miles of sailing? Paul has been on many different seas. In fact, let's go to 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 25. It says, 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was pelted with stones. 3 times I was what? 3 times I was shipwrecked. And look at this. I spent a night and a day in the open sea. Dang. That's hardcore. Never done that before. Never even want to do it before. All right? And I'm not talking, it's not like just talking about spending a day. Imagine just floating out at sea for a night and a day. That's shark bait, baby. All right? So Paul is experienced here, and he's talking out of wisdom. He knows what time of the season it is. He's telling them not to do it. They take a vote. The centurion wants to go on. The ship crew wants to move on. They're outnumbered. That's it. They're sailing to Phoenix. Okay? So now they just need the weather to line up so they can take off. So they decide to sail to Phoenix. They just need good weather. So look at what happens. Verse 13. It says, when a gentle south wind, like out of a Hallmark card or something, when a gentle south wind began to blow, they saw their opportunity. This is it. This is it, guys. We got an awesome south wind. You know the direction they're going. They're going upshore. They need a south wind to help them get there and everything else. So it's perfect. This is exactly what they need, the opportunity. So they saw their opportunity, so they weighed anchor, which is pulling up the anchor. They weighed anchors and sailed along the shore of Crete. But verse 14, before very long, a wind of hurricane force called the northeastern. You do not want a northeastern wind. It is the worst case scenario to be sailing this way where land is here and get a northeastern wind to do this. It is worst case scenario. And hurricane force, it's not like the south gentle wind that they had. This is hurricane force wind called the northeastern, swept down from the island. The ship was caught by the storm and could not head into the wind. Now, if you notice, when I showed you the picture of the ship, it didn't have a rudder, it had 2 oars, and it had a sail on it, but it didn't have anything to drive the ship. So, you know what? That pretty much meant that they were at mercy of the wind. So, swept down the island. Verse said, the ship was caught by the storm and could not head into the wind, so we gave way to it and were driven along. As we passed to the lee of a small island called Cauda, we were hardly able to make the lifeboat secure. I like how it says we were hardly able, because if you need to read different translations, it says basically like that they secured the lifeboat, because, and it's interesting that it says lifeboat here, because it says like a skiff or something else in different translations. But no, this was a little boat that was on the back of the big boat that they would use as an emergency boat or whatever to go sail from the big boat to shore or whatever. So they had to pick this boat with like winches and ropes out of the water and bring it onto their boat and secure it. And that's not it. It goes on. So the men hoisted it aboard, and they passed ropes under the ship itself to hold it together. So they not only took the little small skiff off of the water and secured it in the boat, they did something else to strengthen the whole of the boat. They dropped cables or ropes down underneath the boat and wrapped them around the boat and then across the middle of the boat and secured them so that if they hit water or hit anything, the boat wouldn't fall apart. I mean, you can just picture this. This would make a great movie. So the man hoisted it aboard. They passed ropes under the ship and hold it together because they were afraid they would run aground on the sandbars of Syrtis. Sandbars of Syrtis were known also to be rocky. So if you hit some rocks, bad news. They lowered the sea anchors and they let the ship be driven along. And I'll spend time on this, otherwise I'll take forever. Verse 18, we took such a violent battering from the storm that the next day they began to throw the cargo overboard. On the 3rd day, by the way, this is 3 days of just being battered by the storm. On the 3rd day, they threw the ship's tackle overboard with their own hands. Now, again, this is like the cargo that they need and everything else. Tackle's not like, they threw a couple of fishing poles over with a couple of tackle boxes, all right? No, they're throwing furniture over. They're throwing anything they can over to lighten the load of this boat because they do not want this thing to sink. They threw the ship's tackle overboard with their own hands. Verse 20. When neither sun nor stars appeared for many days, it's already been 3, now it's many, and the storm continued raging, we finally gave up all hope of being saved. So, just so you can know, a half a day's journey now, half day's journey up to Phoenix has now turned into a week at least, minimum at this point, on water, in the open water. And by the way, they were so afraid of landing on a shore with rocks in it that they put down anchors, all right? And they just let these anchors drag along the bottom of the sea and I don't know if you've ever been on a boat in a windy day. I have. One day. You're probably not getting out of here anytime soon. One day I went flounder fishing with a buddy of mine that was on my boat, and we put in the Texas City Dike, and the winds were anywhere between 18 to 20, gusting up to 25, okay? And that's choppy, and that's not great. But what we wanted to do was to get around from the Texas City Dike, go around to the Galveston Ship Channel. Because in the Galveston Ship Channel, there was shelter from the wind and so on. And so we were going to the lee of the ship channel. Yeah. So anyway, y'all ain't enjoying this as much as me. I'm sorry. But we went, and then because we were in the ship channel, we were guarded by some of the wind. It was still very, very windy, though, where we were. we went up close to the shore, and we dropped the anchor, and we let out about 20 feet of anchor rope. And I had a really good anchor that dug into the ground, especially up there in Galveston. It was rocky so once that anchor digs in, it's not going anywhere. But we let out about 20-something feet of anchor rope. And let me tell you, by the end of that day, me and Brandon was wore out. We did really good flounder fishing, too. We caught a jack Clavell as well. It was a really good day. One of the best days that we had fishing, not weather-wise, but what happened is that that boat all day long, because of the 20-mile-an-hour wind, just constantly beat on the water and rocked back and forth. Because you can imagine if the anchor's like this, and you're just constantly going back and forth because of the wind all day long, just sitting there fishing. So picture this. Like, these guys are anchored out in the middle of the ocean, and they're being dragged. And instead of like being dragged with the wind, they are being held down by their anchors, and they're still being moved. But instead of moving with the wind, the wind is just constantly battering them back and forth like this, just nonstop. That is the most horrible situation you could ever imagine yourself in. Has anybody ever been seasick before? A couple of people. There's two different kinds of seasicks. There's a seasick that you can get, and you can go up to the back of the boat and throw up and get it over with and kind of just still enjoy your trip, which is the one that I had. And then there's the kind where you get sweats and you just feel absolutely horrible, and there's no kind of relief whatsoever. No relief. There is no relief. It is the most horrible feeling that you're ever going to have. And I've taken 2 people out with me offshore fishing that got that kind of seasick. And I told them, once we go out, like once we're out, we're out. We're not coming back. So once we were out, they dealt with it all day long. And you know how they dealt with it? They slept on the bottom of my boat. They literally, it was so bad, they just felt so bad, they laid down, and we're, 25, 30 miles out, dude. We're not coming back. I got pictures of this one guy, like, laying on the bottom of my boat, just he's done. He's just done. Anyway, it is the most horrible feeling that you could ever, and you have 276 people that are all like this on this boat. There is no relief in sight. They're being dashed back and forth from hurricane force winds. They are anchored off, so they're getting beat to a pulp, and they are just sick as the dogs. People are throwing up. Not only that, they can't eat. When you're sick like that, you have no desire to put more food in you. And so it even said it here, like after several days of the raging, they just didn't have anything. They didn't eat. And so it's just the epitome of miserable. And this is what Paul and his 2 friends and this entire crew is now dealing with. So hopefully you can picture this. They're tired, they're sick, and as we just read, they're hopeless. Verse 21. After they had gone a long time without food, Paul stood up before them and said, "Men, you should have taken my advice." Well, that's great. That'll make everybody feel better. Like, I got something to say. I'm just going to say it. You guys should have taken my advice and not sailed for Crete. Okay, I got that out of the way. Now, then you would have spared yourselves the damage and loss. Verse 22. But now I urge you to keep up your courage, because not one of you will be lost. That's a big statement. Only the ship will be destroyed. Well, I thought you were going to encourage us. How are we going to be alive and the ship's going to be gone? Like, that doesn't sound fun at all. Like, we're already not having fun, but we're going to stay alive and the ship's going to be destroyed. Well, thanks, Paul. Appreciate that. But verse 23, last night an angel of God to whom I belong and whom I serve stood beside me and said, "Do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand trial before Caesar. I want to just reiterate what that says there, verse 24. Do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand trial before Caesar. And God has graciously given you the lives of all who sail with you. Verse 25. So keep your courage, men, for I have faith in God that it will happen just as he told me. Verse 26. Nevertheless, we must run aground on some island. That's it. Stand to your feet. Such a great chapter, man. And we're only halfway through it. We got another one of these in 3 weeks. If it's not Father's Day by the time we get there. Might be 4. I haven't looked at the calendar yet, but so here we go. The reason I kind of hesitated and wanted to repeat this, verse 24. I don't know if you could throw that back up, Josh, for me. Verse 24. And he said, do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand trial before Caesar. This is so important because honestly, like, this is so easy to apply to life. Like, a lot of people know exactly what it means and feels like to try everything that you can try, to put in the applications, to, rearranging, pulling money out of savings to do this, and just whatever it is, to be left with no answer, really. And the reason I bring this up is because this goes right back to what God had promised Paul. All right? You're in the most horrible situation, a crew abandoned at sea, lost, they don't have a clue. They don't have a clue where they are. They're in the middle of the Mediterranean, I think. I don't know. I think so. Mediterranean Sea. And they're just gone. And they're sick. They're throwing up. It's just the most horrible situation. They've lost all hope. Scripture says they lost all hope. And Paul stood up and says, it's not going to be great, but we're all going to live. And because God told me that I have to stand trial in front of Caesar. Now, this is so important because oftentimes whenever you've tried everything and you've lost all hope and you have nothing really to fall back on, the only thing that you can fall back on is God's promises. What has God promised to you? And that's what we need to make sure that we always fall back on. When we're going through any kind of period in life that's a struggle, that when we feel like we've lost all hope, I'll never forget. And I don't know that you've ever personally felt like you've got a promise from the Lord. But I know way back whenever God kind of told me we were going to be pastors and start a church and so on, I didn't know how it all was working out, but I really felt like that was a promise of the Lord. And so I held on to that for a long time, even through a season that I had pretty much lost all hope in. And so this is one of the things I like about this is unique to Paul. Like nobody else on the boat has a promise from the Lord but Paul. And this is now affecting 276 people that are on board. Again, where do I get that number from? It's at the latter part of this chapter. If you read down. Yes. So if you read down to the end of this chapter, it tells you there's 276 people total here. But we'll get to that, and whenever we do, I guess, 4 weeks or 3 weeks. Either way, this was a promise to Paul, and it's amazing how, there we go, verse 37. Altogether, there were 276 of us on board. So, Paul, this is a specific promise given to Paul that affected the lives of all these other men. And so, look, if you're here and you've gone through it and you have no hope, you've got to find a way through all the craziness. I like there's a scripture in Ephesians that said, having done all you can do, stand. Find a way to just stand on God's promises. Which is, even if you've got to just break it down to the very bottom of the promises, which is what we talked about earlier. Like, hey, this is all temporary. It's all going to end. One day I know I'm going to heaven. By the way, that's a promise you can stand on. So, in the middle of despair, it's the promise of the Lord that encourages us. It encourages all these people. They finally begin to eat, get better. I'm not going to tell you how the story goes. You need to read it. It's great. But it's the promises of the Lord that are always faithful. Let's pray as we close. Father, what a fun Sunday for me. I don't know if anybody else enjoyed it, but I love this stuff because, first of all, it's a great story. And it really just shows us the trouble that Paul went through to be able to get to Rome, to be able to testify about you in Rome. And sometimes we feel like Paul feels, or at least how all the other crew feels, where we've prayed, we don't seem like we're getting an answer. We've asked, we don't see any clarity. There seems to be a dead end at every turn. And yet, there is one thing that always stands beyond all this misdirection, all this despair, all this loss of hope. And that is that you are faithful to what you have promised. What I like about this is an individual promise that you've given Paul. This is an angel, the angel of the Lord that stood beside Paul. Nobody else saw this. And here they're having to believe in Paul, saying that there will be no loss of life, just loss of ship. Because God's promised him that he must stand on trial in Rome in front of Caesar. What an interesting turn of events, that at times we have nothing else to base anything else on but your word. And it is your word that always prevails. So when we don't get answers from our family members, our friends, our coworkers, when we don't get answers from others, we can always turn to your word for what is faithful. And even though we may not get a clear, certain answer, do this, do that, we will stand on your word that never fails. Because ultimately, our hope is in you. Thank you for reminding us of this through this journey that Paul went on, this shipwreck, this crazy, wild, storm-led journey. Always remind us that you will never leave us and never forsake us. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Amen. Let's give God a hand clap, church, for he's good. What you want? Well, that's it. Love you guys. I hope we'll see you back next. Well, I won't see you next Sunday, but do not skip church.